All right, we'll start. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this important discussion. My name is Tamara Kharroub. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and I will be chairing the discussion for today. I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar titled Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights, the Case of the Israeli Surveillance of the Palestinians. As many of you have been following up, artificial intelligence has been receiving a lot of attention in the media lately, both regarding its positive potentials as well as the risks it might pose. For Palestinians, however, the dangers of AI-powered applications and discriminatory technologies are already a reality. The Israeli occupation and apartheid regime has ramped up its constant mass surveillance of Palestinians and increased its use of espionage, algorithmic monitoring, and predictive policing, and automated weapons. While violations of the rights of Palestinians under Israel's decades-long military occupation are well documented, the increasing role of technology in this repressive environment has been less studied. And that's why we're glad today to be discussing one of the important reports that came out lately, a report by Amnesty International titled Automated Apartheid. According to the report, Israel is extensively using AI-powered facial recognition technology to entrench its control and oppression of the Palestinian people, especially in Hebron and East Jerusalem. And many of you may have heard of the Red Wolf surveillance system, which we will get into in more details. Because of that, we at Arab Center Washington, D.C. wanted to organize this webinar and convene this great lineup of experts that joined us today to discuss the findings of this Amnesty report, but also explore in general the role of artificial intelligence in the Israeli occupation and its biometric surveillance of Palestinians, and also address the implications of this environment for human rights and international humanitarian law. Some of the questions we'd like to get answered today include: how is Israel using AI and other tools to fragment, segregate, control, and dehumanize the Palestinian population? How does technology affect Palestinians' experiences living in a constant state of insecurity and being subjected to violence that is increasingly becoming automated? What is the relationship between Israel's tech industries and its military apparatus? What is the legal framework covering the use of AI in the context of occupation? And what recommendations can be made to counter the discriminatory and inhumane effects of this and other technologies? To answer these questions, hopefully in the next hour and a half, we have a great panel of experts. Thank you all for joining us today. I will briefly introduce them in speaking order. Rasha Rahim is the Director of Amnesty Tech at Amnesty International. Shtaya is a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Sophia Goodfriend is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Duke University. And Rohan Talbot is the Director of Advocacy and Campaigns and at Medical Aid for Palestinians. Thanks to all of you for taking the time and for being with us today. In terms of format, I'll be giving each of our speakers today about 10 to 12 minutes to present their interventions, and then we will have about 30 minutes to take questions from the audience. I would like to remind our audience that you can send in your questions at any time during the discussion. Feel free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom. And for those who are watching on social media and on our website, you can send in your questions by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. Again, events@arabcenterdc.org. You can identify yourself and your affiliation and indicate to whom your question is addressed. And we will try to take as many questions as possible. And with that, we will start the discussion. Let's get into it. Rasha, I will start with you. Rasha from Amnesty International. If you could give us a little bit more detail about the report titled Automated Apartheid, the details of this facial recognition technology and the constant surveillance of Palestinians. Go ahead, Rasha.
Thank you so much for having me on the panel. especially with such esteemed colleagues. So as you mentioned, I'm the director of Amnesty Tech, which is Amnesty International's technology and human rights program. And in May, we published a report called Automating Apartheid, which I'm going to talk you through now. I just want to give you a flavor of the structure of my presentation. So first, I'm going to contextualize the report in our broader work on facial recognition tech. Then I'm going to discuss the focus of the report and the key findings. Then a quick note on the methodology, and then delving deeper into the findings. And then finally, I'll give our key recommendations and I'll signpost you to where you can find some more information. So just to begin, Amnesty International has been working on banning facial recognition technologies since 2020. We consider facial recognition technologies for identification as a tool of mass surveillance, which can never be a proportionate interference with the rights to privacy, freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. And our campaign initially focused on New York City in 2020 to 2021, where we called for a ban on facial recognition tech in the context of Black Lives Matter protests, as we observed that FRTs were being, when I say FRTs, I mean facial recognition tech, had been used to surveil particularly Black and Brown communities. And with the help of volunteers from around the world, thousands of volunteers participated in a project in which we were trying to tag facial recognition cameras around New York City. So we tagged 15,280 surveillance cameras across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. And then we turned our attention to the use of facial recognition tech in Hyderabad, as we observed that the government of India had initiated the construction of a command and control center, which basically would connect the city's vast CCTV infrastructure to 600,000 facial recognition enabled cameras. And given the context there of policing protests, of identifying voters in municipal elections, etc., we also called for a ban on facial recognition there. So Amnesty is calling for a ban on facial recognition for use in mass surveillance. And we then turned our attention to the use of FRTs in the OPT. So now let me talk about the focus of the report. So as I mentioned, we published this report in May. And really, this report is different from others, as it really focuses on the ways in which FRTs are used to control the movement and space that Palestinians inhabit. And it really underscores the ways in which this is about domination and control and keeping Palestinians under control, and creating an intentional coercive environment. And it focuses on human rights violations related to FRTs, particularly focusing on the rights of freedom of movement, privacy, freedom of expression, assembly, equality, and non-discrimination. And it elaborates on Amnesty International's finding that the treatment of Palestinians, whose rights it controls, amounts to apartheid. And this detailed legal analysis on our finding of apartheid can be found in a report that we published last year, and I'm not going to cover this here or in the presentation, and this is not covered in the report. So this report specifically examines Israel's use of surveillance as a tool which Israel uses to enforce and maintain its system of oppression and domination over Palestinians in the OPT. And it presents a non-exhaustive overview of the scale and breadth of biometric surveillance and the human rights violations associated with these technologies, with a focus on Hebron and East Jerusalem. And in terms of the users of facial recognition tech, it focuses on surveillance as carried out by Israeli security forces, including the Israeli army operating under the Ministry of Defense and Israeli police forces under the Ministry of National Security. Now, just a quick note on methodology. So I won't go through this in a huge amount of detail because you can see it on the slide. But it was the research of this report was undertaken in several stages using mixed qualitative research methods. So this included desk research, also using open source intelligence and interviews. We had an advisory committee of 6 external tech and surveillance experts advising us on the substance of the report. We carried out on-the-ground field visits to Hebron and East Jerusalem. Israeli NGO Breaking the Silence also provided testimonies from Israeli military personnel describing their use of facial recognition tech in Hebron. We also did an in-person on-the-ground survey of facial recognition cameras using a GPS-enabled 360 camera in East Jerusalem. And also Amnesty's digital verification core analyzed open source videos, which displayed the detention of Palestinians by security forces where surveillance tech had appeared to be used for registration, identification, or recording. Now, in terms of the report findings, can you see the next slide? Yes, here we go. So the key report findings are basically that facial recognition tech is used to restrict Palestinians' right to freedom of movement and is used in ways that fragment, segregate, and control Palestinians in the OPT. Now, this all ultimately enables Israel to maintain its system of apartheid, and this is enforced in three ways. One is through physical infrastructure, which is used to expand the reach of Israeli authorities' control. Second is the creation of exclusively Palestinian databases for purposes of surveillance. And third is the use of facial recognition software for mass and targeted discriminatory surveillance at flying and permanent checkpoints. And we also identified foreign vendors who were found to be the manufacturers of hardware used to feed the surveillance infrastructures that we talked about. Now, we can't know for sure whether they have provided this technology directly, but we do know for sure that those were the hardware that we observed. And the two companies implicated are TKH Security, which is domiciled in the Netherlands, and Hikvision, which is domiciled in China. Sorry, let's see for the slide. And then, as Tamara mentioned in her intro, we also identified the existence of a tool that had never before been disclosed, which is Red Wolf. Now, Red Wolf is a system that is used in checkpoints in Hebron, and it uses facial recognition to record the biometric data of people who move around the city. And notably, the technology records individuals' information on the surveillance system, even if they've not knowingly consensually registered with it. And effectively, the way that it functions is that it automates the arbitrary movement restrictions and institutionalized discrimination, which help maintain Israel's apartheid system. Now, this system is only one of many that have been used in an experimental fashion against Palestinians. You will have heard of Blue Wolf and Wolfpack, which were discovered by the Washington Post. And for those unfamiliar with these systems, Blue Wolf is an app that is used by smartphones by soldiers to register as many Palestinians as possible. It's called they sort of named it the Facebook of Palestinians. And they ran competitions to see who could capture the most pictures. And so that sort of incentivized them to keep Palestinians under constant observation. And Wolfpack is a vast database which contains imagery and all information available exclusively on Palestinians in the West Bank. So, for example, permits, family members, license plates, whether they're wanted by the Israeli authorities or not. And the purpose of Wolfpack is to store the profiles of every Palestinian in the West Bank. And in East Jerusalem, we uncovered the existence of Mabat. So this is a vast facial recognition network, which Israeli police have expanded in the Old City. And it supports, obviously, a facial recognition system, which is known as Mabat. It enables security forces to identify protesters and keep Palestinians under constant observation. And just important to note that these systems have expanded alongside illegal settlements, which have encroached on Palestinian neighborhoods in the Old City and other areas. So as settlements have increased, the surveillance infrastructure has also increased. Surveillance then increases, and so it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And just to sort of more concisely summarize the key findings of the report, facial recognition tech and other biometric tech are powerful new tools which are used to fragment, segregate, and control Palestinians in the OPT, and ultimately to enforce Israel's system of apartheid. These technologies entrench restrictions on freedom of movement, they bolster existing physical restrictions, and they make them more permanent. This surveillance is part of a wider coercive environment which routinely makes the lives of Palestinians unbearable, and it's aimed at forcing them to leave areas of strategic interest to Israeli authorities. And the deployment of facial recognition tech in Hebron and East Jerusalem ultimately has implications on not only the right to privacy, but freedom of movement, equality and discrimination, expression, association, and peaceful assembly. I'm just going to run through the key recommendations that we made as well. So we made recommendations to businesses, to the state of Israel, and to other states and regional actors. So just on businesses, as I mentioned, we identified 2 companies who we believe are implicated in the provision of hardware for FRT. But we know that there are many other companies. We just don't know which companies they are for sure. And so I think one of the things that we need to follow up on as researchers, as investigators, is who are the other companies involved, and we need to make clear that companies also have responsibilities and that they risk complicity in the crime of apartheid in providing this type of technology to Israel. So one of our main calls to businesses is to stop supplying technologies that can be used by the Israeli state to implement their system of apartheid, to immediately cease the production of facial recognition and remote biometric recognition tech that enable mass surveillance and targeted surveillance. To the state of Israel, it's to immediately cease the deployment of facial recognition tech for identification against Palestinians in the OPT, including at checkpoints, and to end unlawful mass surveillance and discriminatory targeted surveillance. And of course, a very important recommendation is to end the system of apartheid that it inflicts on Palestinians. To other states and regional actors, we're calling on them to regulate companies domiciled in their jurisdictions to ensure that these companies don't provide surveillance tech to Israel that can be used to maintain its system of apartheid. And of course, to enact legislation that bans the use, development, production, sale, and export of remote biometric tech for mass surveillance, as well as facial recognition tech for identification purposes. And I realized that was a lot of information. So if you would like more, you have here some details on the slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rasha, for this comprehensive and quite alarming overview of the report. Next, excuse me, next I'd like to move to Muna. Muna, could you give us a little bit more of context on this? So the Amnesty report discusses mass surveillance of Palestinians in Hebron and Jerusalem. But the surveillance system is bigger than that, the Israeli surveillance system of Palestinians. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the use of mass surveillance, spyware, autonomous weapons, even social media campaigns are being used as methods of control, whether it's blackmail or extortions, etc., those tactics against Palestinians? Go ahead.
Thanks, Tamara, and thanks, Rasha, for starting this. That's a good intro to start, but also I want to start from the reality that we are living. A couple of days ago, Benjamin Netanyahu, he announced that he intends to discuss a national AI policy in both the civilian and the security sphere. And he said that just as we turned Israel into a global cyber power, we will also do so in AI. And that is alarming. They basically are pioneers, as Rasha started talking about surveillance. They are pioneers in this. In Israel, nowadays, there are 28 surveillance companies. 8 of them are led by ex-military leaders, which means that there is no separation or there is no differences between those surveillance and military companies and the state of surveillance, and both are interconnected. and aiming at the end of the day of militarizing and securitizing Palestinian digital or like online and in-person places. I can go through the details and can tell you more about that. Let me start first with the AI and with the most recent project, like the huge contract, the $1.2 billion contract between the Israeli military and Google and Amazon, which basically called the so-called Nimbus project. And this project is basically aims at utilizing AI for the purpose of or to serve the military purposes in Israel. And when we are talking about that, we are talking about utilizing those tools to suppress Palestinians and to be complicit more in the apartheid regime, like as Russia started. And basically, the project will provide the government and the defense establishment and the others with an all income. I'm here quoting them or quoting the ministry that said that basically the establishment and the others with an all encompassing good solution. They call that as solutions, but according to the training documents that were leaked by the Intercept a couple of like last year, basically Google is providing the Israeli government with the full suite of machine learning and AI tools available through Google Cloud platforms. And such kind of project basically is used like different kind of technologies such as facial detection, automated image categorization, object tracking, and even sentiment analysis that basically claims to assess the emotional content of pictures, speeches, and writings. And from our like reality that we recognize that such kind of data and information is mostly used to militarize and for predictive policing. Wherever they are used to basically securitize our spaces and to arrest Palestinians, to interrogate Palestinians, and sometimes to sentence Palestinians. In the beginning of the May uprising in 2021, we've seen like the young people when they started taking the streets. First thing they did as they started breaking the CCTV cameras in the public squares in Jerusalem, and that didn't come out of the blue. It's not sabotaging for the aim of sabotaging. It's because they feel that such kind of tools are used to suppress them and to increase their oppression, to double that. So we can understand people's behavior and how they react towards surveillance technologies from like if you live the reality and if you see how such kind of technologies are used to against people. The Israeli at the same time in 2021, the Israeli Shabak basically they also use the tracking systems to intimidate people who went to Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is one of the holy places for Muslims. And they use that to intimidate them. They send them a text SMS messages telling them that we've spotted you in Al-Aqsa Mosque and we will hold you accountable because you are involved in a violence activities. So prayers or worshippers who are going to Al-Aqsa Mosque for praise were intimidated, were threatened to be held accountable just because they thought that such kind of thing as violence activities. So just like that's just a small examples on how the surveillance technologies and AI is basically used to militarize and securitize our spaces. On the other hand, and since Russia touched based on Hebron, which is like a scary place to be at, they called Hebron as a smart city, but it's a good example of a very automated surveilled or space. Whenever you are walking there, you can see the CCTV cameras, the facial recognition techniques, but the worst out of all of that is the so-called smart gun or the smart shooter that they developed there to be used against people. And basically, such kind of machines is used, like they are also automating the suppression or the apartheid regime that we are living under. This gun fires stun generates and sponge tipped bullets, and also capable of firing tear gas. Here we are talking about such kind of advanced technologies that's also being tested as part of a pilot scheme at Shuhada Street checkpoint. So we are talking about an open laboratory where they are like first developing and then testing such kind of technologies on Palestinians before start selling that worldwide. And why I'm saying selling that worldwide, that's based also on researches and previous campaigns that were led by international organizations and movements. Basically, a couple of years ago, there was a huge campaign against Microsoft, who was going to invest $75 million in Anyvision, which is an Israeli surveillance company, to develop facial recognition techniques and test that on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory before it start profiting from that. There was a huge campaign led by our partners, or Jewish Voices for Peace in the US, who basically were pressuring Microsoft for their involvement in war crimes and violations of international law for being complicit with such technologies. After a huge campaign, they divested this investment, but again, if Microsoft divested, that doesn't mean all the international tech companies are divesting. Now, like the Nimbus project that I mentioned before, it's like it was signed in 2021, and there has been a lot of lobbying and campaigning from within those companies. We've seen Amazon and Google workers mobilizing themselves and campaigning against their own companies to stop such kind of violations. And some of them were basically threatened to be fired, and some of them were fired based on such kind of activism. Here we can understand how such involvement is dangerous. It's not only dangerous against on Palestinians, but also it's dangerous against everyone who is pro-Palestinian or who is a human rights defender who has principles and like just shows such kind of human rights principles and defend such kind of thing. And just to touch upon like the whole reality of living under a state of surveillance, the best term to describe the reality in Palestine is again the panopticon. I've mentioned that quite a few times, but I can't stress on that enough, because it's literally, you feel that you are watched, you are spied on, you are surveilled all the time. If you are walking in the streets, or if you are in a public square, if you are on the internet, because we have seen like how military leaders or spokesperson are on the social media platforms, are trying to spread propaganda, disinformation, and fake news, first to like make this internal fight in the Palestinian community, and other times to have their propaganda spread, and people like because we don't have like such a media machine as they have, so people will take such kind of information as for facts. And this is dangerous, especially for people who are living under military occupation for decades now. Beside that, like the whole idea of using surveillance technologies is like Russia started speaking about like the mass surveillance, but there are much more, especially when we are talking about spywares and malwares, who is basically used to silence Palestinian human rights defenders. We've all heard about NSO and Pegasus, which is basically used to silence human rights defenders, political opponents, journalists, not only in Palestine, but all over the world. We've heard about cases in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Morocco, and in Palestine. Like in November 2021, we've seen how how Pegasus of NSO was used against the 6 Palestinians human rights defenders, whose later on their organizations were designated as quote unquote terrorist organizations by the Israeli government with no claims, with no evidence on that, even after like the whole process of checking that from the EU countries and others, they didn't find an evidence of having such a thing. So they are using that to silence Palestinians and to spread the fear and to spread the effect of surveillance, which is more dangerous than the surveillance. Even if we are thinking how we can just get out of like the whole surveillance system, the effect of surveillance is there and gonna stay there, and it's affecting us on the longer term more than on the short term. For the short term implications, we're changing the way how we are talking to our family members, our colleagues, and our beloved ones. We're not saying things as facts as we should do so, because we are afraid that our phone calls are monitored and are surveilled. But we are changing that. But on the longer term, we can see how trust relationships are collapsing. We can't trust each other anymore. We can see how this kind of trust relationship, it's not only between peoples and government, but also between people in the same community, in the same society. And for a very long time, like Israel has been working on fragmenting us. We have Palestinians in West Bank, Gaza Strip, Jerusalem, 48, and then Palestinians in diaspora. And all of that kind of fragmentation is now echoed and increased because of the effect of surveillance. And sometimes we can see how people are paranoid from the impact of surveillance. So we can see how surveillance is impacting Palestinians and as making our life harder than it's just living under military occupation, because it's not only like that. And beyond the trust relations, it's also changing our behavior and taking us more toward extremism. And let me give you an example. Maybe Sophia will talk about her research in Jerusalem that she conducted with Hamle. But there's one of the interviews that Sophia did. A woman from Jerusalem, she said that she's putting hijab inside her home because of she feels that the CCTV camera is invading her safe space, her home. And we can see how Muslim women see their home as their safe space, where they should not put hijab on their heads. When you start putting that on your head, with a longer term, you can see more women putting hijab on their head because of the effect of surveillance. This means that this is taking us for extremism. And like a decade later, if we're just seeing women put hijab on their head, so we can understand where is that coming from. It's coming from the reality that is forcing us to do so, because our safe space is invaded by the CCTV cameras from the Israeli military occupation forces. So those are just like bits and pieces from the reality. But if you've been to Palestine and if you walked in the streets, you can see much more. You can see also how people are behaving, trying to behave at their best on the social media, on their phone calls, or in the physical spaces, just because of the impact of surveillance. I'll stop here because like this is a huge topic, but I'm happy to answer any of the questions that the audience have. Thank you.
Thank you, Muna, for this important discussion on the impact of surveillance on Palestinians, but also for putting this in the larger global context and why other people in the world should care. Next, we move to Sophia. Sophia, Muna did mention a little bit about autonomous weapons and the smart shooter, and a couple of examples that she mentioned, but could you expand a little bit on that, whether it's using AI, drones, or algorithms, and what are their implications for the rights of Palestinians? And more broadly, if you could discuss a little bit for our audience, the human cost of AI. And I know that a lot of questions for you, but I know you've done some work on the relationship between the Israeli tech industry, which is somehow touted as a private sector, this tech utopia, innovative industry, and its relationship with the Israeli military apparatus. Go ahead, Sophia, the microphone is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone who spoke before me. Those are great questions. I'll jump in. I think I'm going to answer them a bit in reverse. So I want to provide some historical context first to talk when we're talking about what's going on today in the fields of AI and warfare in Palestine. I'll also talk about the human cost of automated surveillance in the West Bank and the human cost of automated warfare in Gaza. And lastly, I'll kind of touch on some of the global implications that I think some other speakers today will discuss as well. So we really can't talk about the rise of Israel's surveillance apparatus and its leadership in AI without talking about the rise of a US-based surveillance industry in the 90s and 2000s. So the rise of a Silicon Valley-based tech industry, as most of us probably know, spurred huge changes in how military superpowers waged war. Intelligence units worldwide were really restructured to operate like tech startups. And this happened in Israel as well. It really followed suit. So from the 2000s, from 2000 to 2010, say, Israel's intelligence units grew exponentially. They grew exponentially, and military generals came to describe them really as a collection of mini startups. Today, there's more soldiers in Israeli intelligence units than in the Navy, and I think Unit 8200, which is Israel's intelligence unit, actually has more soldiers than any other unit in the Israeli army. And today, these units are really celebrated domestically and abroad as hubs for innovation. Within Israel, the narrative kind of goes that these intelligence units and the military writ large really feeds its civilian technology industry. People who serve in 8,200 Israeli soldiers who serve in these units really see their army experience first and foremost as a way to land a high-paying job in the civilian technology industry. And many people I talk to in my research, I'm a journalist and I'm finishing a PhD at Duke, which touches on all of these topics, describe their time in the military is really removed from the ethical quandaries of maintaining Israeli occupation. They see, 2 to 4 years spent listening in on phone calls, building up cyber weapons as very different from, say, manning a checkpoint, guarding a settlement, or working as a sniper. They see them as quite distinct from maintaining the occupation. And so I think also this comes from the fact that these intelligence units, from the time that you're in the army, it's really billed as an opportunity to land a really good job afterwards. So you can attend networking events at Tel Aviv startups during your military service. You can line up high-paying jobs from other people who are in the same unit as you, and et cetera. So I think in the past 20 years, we've also seen, as Israel's technology industry, which writ large really grew, we saw Israel, like many other countries, beginning to outsource the work of its military to private technology firms that sprouted up within Israel. So many of these surveillance companies are staffed and headed by ex-soldiers or generals who gain coveted technological expertise during their military service. And today we I think those of us in the United States and abroad know the names of the more notorious firms like Black Cube, the NSO group, which Mona mentioned, and AnyVision, which is a biometric company that's now called Ustu. These are all private companies that sell invasive surveillance technology abroad, but have their origins within Israel and have also a history of being contracted to do the work of the Israeli military. And so in recent years, we've seen a lot of this technology come under international condemnation. Amnesty Tech Rasha and her team did an amazing job of exposing some 50,000 human rights defenders, politicians, journalists whose phones were hacked with NSO spyware. So we can see this direct link between Israel's military, its private technology industry, and the erosion of fundamental human rights worldwide. And this really stems from these close ties that have been developed and maintained between the military and Israel's technology industry. And today, even despite this bad press, I really should mention that within Israel, these connections are really a source of pride. Many Israelis see their technology sector as the secret ingredient, that thing that's really catapulted the economy into the 21st century and, made Israel this celebrated startup nation abroad. But as Mona has touched on, the story of Israel's emergence as a homeland security capital and surveillance hub really looks incredibly different for Palestinians, especially those living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So as Israel's technology sectors and its military intelligence apparatus grew in the last 20 years, a new generation of Israelis became much more alienated from the effects of the occupation. They were able to kind of see it again as a key to landing a high-paying job, but many Palestinians could not. And so I think other speakers will kind of touch on this, but I'll just say about the human cost of the proliferation of advanced surveillance technology like biometrics, the system of Red Wolf that Rasha and Amnesty Tech exposed, and the other kinds of digital surveillance that Mona was talking about. In places like Hebron and East Jerusalem, you have biometric cameras that are tracking civilians as they leave their homes, as they go to work, as they go to school. You have soldiers stopping children on the street as they're leaving school. There are reports of this happening, and taking their pictures to add them to a biometric database that they do not consent to be enrolled in. You have soldiers breaking into private homes to reinstall and reboot surveillance cameras that are literally on top of Palestinian roofs. And you have unmanned drones flying over Palestinian cities like Nablus and Hebron. We saw reports of that this fall and winter as Israeli army raids throughout the West Bank were escalating. And so the net effect of all of this dragnet surveillance causes immense psychological damage to civilians. There's tons of reports that listeners can see, and Amnesty has done great work on this, as has Mona's written on this as well. But many young people that I've talked to in the research that I was conducting for Hamla and for my dissertation talk about the overwhelming silencing effect of all this technology. So people are apprehensive and even scared to post on social media platforms for fear that something they say will be taken out of context and land them in prison. They're afraid of, using the kinds of platforms that people in other places worldwide kind of take for granted, like Signal or WhatsApp, to even talk to their friends. And it's really important to note, and Amnesty again has touched on this in their report, that these security systems, these surveillance systems really only seem to work against Palestinians. So the proliferation of cameras, spyware, drones, and what have you has not deterred settler violence throughout the West Bank. We see the increase of settler violence, actually, and it's also allowed Jewish vigilantes to conduct immense violent acts with impunity, despite the West Bank kind of being lauded by Israeli generals who talk about smart cities as one of the most heavily surveilled places in the world. So I think that's a really important point to kind of think with. And I've talked a lot about surveillance in the West Bank, so I'll talk really briefly here about the technology used in Gaza, and I'll touch on the use of AI and drone warfare. So in recent years, Israeli generals have talked a lot about how AI has served as a kind of a force multiplier in its bombardments on Gaza. They say that algorithms have allowed intelligence units to pinpoint targets in a matter of months, and that's a process that once took years. And generals have also bragged recently that they've deployed the world's first AI-powered drone swarms, which is a collection of anywhere between 10 to 100 drones that can communicate with one another and pinpoint targets without human intervention. So advocates of this technology, the Israeli military, says that it minimizes human casualties and allows targets to be taken out quickly and rapidly. But in reality, as we've seen in the past few years since Israel has started bragging about its use of AI in warfare, it's allowed the bombs and missiles to really fall more frequently. So Israel announced that it used AI for the first time in its bombardments on Gaza in 2021. And since then, we've had a war break out or Israeli bombardments take place on Gaza annually. And since 21, we've seen 300 Palestinians killed in Israeli assaults. That includes thousands of homes destroyed, infrastructure crippled. And instead of really grappling with the humanitarian crisis caused by these bombardments that have become more frequent with this new technology, the Israeli military has taken each war as really an opportunity to broadcast the state-of-the-art weaponry it deploys in its assaults. So this PR campaign, it seems to me that the frequency of these wars is really another kind of PR campaign. And we've also seen, I saw today that this is the second year in a row in which Israeli military exports have broken its own records. So it really shows how the increasing wars on Gaza is really good for the Israeli arms industry, but it really really exacerbates the humanitarian crisis of 16 years of blockade on the Gaza Strip, which has, as we know, left hundreds dead, millions traumatized, and so many more without homes and basic social services. And I think we can go into more detail about the human cost of these trends as well in the Q&A. I think I only have a few moments left, but I just want to say that, you know, we really talk about the dangers of automated warfare in the future tense, and especially today with a lot of media attention going to AI, everything is kind of talked about as this future threat to humanity. But I think, as Mona mentioned, we can really see the human cost of these systems and their effect in the present in Palestine and other countries where these systems are developed and deployed. So I think by conclusion, I want to say that AI might make war easier to wage, but it doesn't make it any less brutal for civilians, Israelis and Palestinians alike, rather than really bringing about any sort of resolution to a decades-long period of violence in the region. It's really allowed this dehumanizing status quo to drag on. So with that, I will leave it to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Before we move to the last speaker, I just want to remind the audience, feel free to send in your questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. And next we have Rohan and looking at the legal framework. Rohan, what are the implications of AI-powered surveillance and predictive policing for international humanitarian law and human rights law under occupation in the Palestinian context, but more generally also, how can regulations ensure respect for human rights principles in the development and use of AI technologies?
Thank you, Tamara, and to the rest of the panelists who have given such brilliant presentations. Everyone else has so far described, I think, really powerfully Israel's uses of these technologies and their really quite horrifying implications for Palestinians' lives. And so, yeah, I'll center my remarks on legal implications, specifically seeking to understand what are Israel's obligations as an occupying power when using these technologies, and then apply those legal tests to the facts of the situation, or at least what's known of the situation, to assess their compliance. I appreciate that legal analysis might not be the most exciting part of the panel, but if we're to have any hope of regulating the use of these technologies, we really do need to know the scope of these duties as a first step towards accountability. And I'll also just end with a few remarks about where I think this might be going if we fail to ensure that adherence to international law, both in the OPT and globally. As has been highlighted, Israel's reported uses of facial recognition technologies broadly fall into three categories, which overlap, of course. The first is the automation of movement controls at checkpoints. The second is the identification and selection of individuals for detention or control by soldiers, for example, the Blue Wolf system. And then thirdly is live automated surveillance for the purpose of capture or control of wanted individuals. And I'm going to focus largely on the latter, though there are implications for all three. And I'm also going to focus specifically on the West Bank, though I'm glad that Sophia's mentioned Gaza, which I'll mention briefly at the end as well. So as an occupying power, and of course, despite its frequent insistence to the contrary, Israel is an occupying power, its conduct in the West Bank is governed by international humanitarian law. And there are two key provisions relating to situations of belligerent occupation, which I think we need to focus on. The first is Article 43 of the 1907 Hague Regulations, what Eyal Ben-Gvir calls, quote, a sort of mini constitution for the occupation administration, which provides that an occupying power must take all measures in its power to restore and ensure as far as possible public order and civil life, while respecting, unless absolutely prevented, the laws in force in the country. And then secondly is Article 27 of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, which requires that protected persons, including civilians in occupied territory, quote, are entitled in all circumstances to the respect for their persons, their honor, their family rights, religious convictions and practices and manners and customs, and that they shall at all times be humanely treated and protected, especially against all acts of violence and threats thereof. However, it's important to note that this provision also provides that the occupying power may, quote, take such measures of control and security in regard to the protected persons as may be necessary as a result of the war. So international humanitarian law establishes that while an occupying power may have some significant leeway to the means and methods by which it asserts control in occupied territory, that is not an unlimited It's not unlimited in scope. And this is the balancing of military exigencies and humanitarian interests in the occupied population, which is the central balancing act of the law of occupation in theory. The technologies we're discussing today were, of course, unthinkable in the 1940s and before, so the provisions of IHL are by themselves incomplete instructions for regulating their use. And while the rights of the occupied population are to be protected, privacy is not explicitly mentioned in those provisions. We know that Israel claims that it needs to use such technologies for its security, but we've obviously heard just now the impacts on Palestinians are very severe. So how is it that we are supposed to, from the outside, assess whether a proportionate and permissible balance is being struck by the use of a new technology, such as facial recognition surveillance? Fortunately, and again, despite Israel's claims to the contrary, Israel is also bound by its overlapping obligations under international human rights law in all of the territory under its effective control, including the occupied territory. Significantly, this also includes the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 17 of which requires that, quote, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, and that everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. That right to privacy extends beyond what we would consider the traditional private sphere, the home, correspondence, wiretapping of phones, to encompass a broader private sphere of autonomous interaction and liberty, which applies to the processing, of course, of a person's biometric data in public spaces. But privacy is not an absolute right, meaning, of course, that states are permitted legitimately to restrict it in certain cases, for example, certain law enforcement situations and the protection of other civilians. But international human rights law establishes that interferences with privacy must meet a few tests, a four-part test, which is cumulative of legality, legitimate aims, necessity, and proportionality. So I'll take those in turn and apply them to what we know. Firstly, legality. This requires that interferences with privacy through surveillance may only be done on the basis of law, and that law must be accessible, clear, precise, and with safeguards against abuse. Who is it that is allowed to conduct surveillance, for what scope, what duration, etc. Essentially, any person must be able to know and foresee what actions that they might take will result in their privacy being limited, for example, criminal activity, and therefore be able to avoid it. Clearly, as we've heard, Palestinians are not extended this possibility. There are no established laws, even no military orders establishing safeguards, as far as we're aware, and certainly not publicly available, for facial recognition technologies used by the Israeli military. And therefore, Palestinians cannot know and do not know when they are being surveilled and their data being captured and processed. As Mona has said, there is a general presumption that people are being surveilled at all times. Secondly, legitimate aims. Privacy may be limited to a certain extent in the interest of, for example, national security, public order or health, or the protection of the rights of others. But these aims must be specific and they must be serious. And for an occupying power, theoretically, again, this may also potentially encompass the security of its own troops and material in some circumstances. Given, however, the well-documented use of Israeli military surveillance practices for political persecution, as we know from whistleblowers from Unit 8200, and its amorphous concept of security, again, this test is completely failed. And certainly, a state would not be allowed to limit privacy for the reason of entrenching and securing illegal settlements or for maintaining a system of apartheid. And then taking necessity and proportionality together, in occupied territory, necessity can be taken to mean either the pressing social needs of the local population, for example, their security, which is clearly not in Israel's intended use of FRT surveillance, or potentially the occupying power's own military exigencies in the conduct of hostilities. But to be proportionate, that privacy interference must be appropriate to achieve the function, must be the least intrusive means to achieve the desired result and the legitimate aim, and the proportionate to the interest to be protected. And of course, these requirements cannot ever be true of a generalized mass surveillance technology, which is processing the biometric data of all people crossing a camera network's path. Interferences with privacy must be done on a case-by-case basis, not blanket in nature, as appears to be the case in the West Bank. And this disproportionality is exacerbated by, of course, the high false positive rate and severe potential consequences for any person incorrectly identified by these technologies. And then finally, one other element on proportionality, the balance of proportionality tilts further away from the interests of the occupied, further towards the interests of the occupied population and away from the occupying military as hostilities subside and as time goes on. Of course, we're now talking of a 56-year occupation. And so Israel is expected to have significantly restored civil and political rights of Palestinians. Of course, it is expected to have ended its occupation, but those rights include privacy, where in fact it has only restricted and entrenched its control further. It seems fairly evident then from that list of tests that Israel's deployment of these technologies is simply not compliant with its legal duties. And one thing I should say is, of course, this legal framework assumes, somewhat naively, that an occupying power is acting in good faith. And as we can probably tell from by ourselves, but as well put by the former UN Special Rapporteur Michael Link and others, Israel is not acting in good faith, as demonstrated by its avaricious and expanding policies of annexation and settlement, and the use of these technologies to maintain an illegal regime, an occupation that has, to quote Michael Link, tipped over into illegality, is simply not permissible. Briefly, I just want to mention the broader potential human rights implications. These have come up briefly, but just to emphasize. Firstly, privacy is the foundational right to other rights, including freedom of assembly, association, and expression. And the chilling effect on these, as we've heard, is very significant. If you know that protest is prohibited, which of course it is by Military Order 101, with a potential prison term and the revocation of a work permit that you and your family need to survive, and other restrictive measures that might be applied, and that soldiers can simply identify and track you automatically, and they know where you live, they know where you work, etc. Are you going to risk it? Few are going to. And then secondly, freedom of movement is also associated with privacy. Palestinians are forced to give over their biometric data to move from one area of occupied territory, such as the West Bank, to another, the East Jerusalem. We should ask, what does it mean for a system of assigned residency if Israel could conceivably tell whether a Jerusalemite Palestinian center of life is no longer in Jerusalem by automatically tracking their movements through these technologies? Two final points. Firstly, on speculation, where is this going? As A.R. Weitzman, now of Forensic Architecture, observes in his book Hollow Land, which I really recommend for people interested in these issues, Israel has sought to render the occupation increasingly invisible in order to absolve itself of the responsibilities that is assumed as an occupying power, including the maintenance of the humanitarian needs of the population, however, without losing its overall security control. And as Sophia has mentioned, this model can be seen most clearly in Gaza, where the occupation remains, but is largely remote controlled due to control of borders, airspace, sea, population registry, imports of goods, exit of people, etc. And so these technologies, facial recognition surveillance, potentially allows Israel to entrench its control with reduced expenditure of blood and treasure. There are fewer flashpoints at checkpoints if a computer is making the decision. There are fewer boots on the ground needed to track and to track suspects. Suspects can be neutralized earlier. The whole thing will cost them less. And meanwhile, the upward pressure that is natural against an occupier dissipates as political organizing becomes harder to maintain and processes squashed, not only on the ground, but in the minds of the occupied people. The rights under threat, I think it's worth emphasizing, are not then simply individual rights. In particular, we should think about collective rights, Palestinians' collective right to self-determination. How can Palestinians collectively develop their political system, their institutions, their society, under what Mona has aptly called the panopticon? And finally, a thought on what does this mean for people in the US, or here in the UK, or in the EU, or anywhere else. A final thought perhaps on that. Israel is a major exporter, as we've heard, of surveillance technologies, not just facial recognition technology. AnyVision, I think, is being used in US hospitals and airports, but also other surveillance tech such as Pegasus spyware, as we've heard. But it doesn't just export the technologies, it also exports the norms around their uses. And so what starts with a captive population in the OPT is not destined to stay there. Israel is potentially using these technologies to consolidate permanent discriminatory control over Palestinians. And so we need to ask, if this isn't opposed, what's to stop Russia using the same technologies to entrench its control over occupied Crimea? If Israel is allowed to use these technologies without limits, how can we counter the techno-dystopia that China has imposed on Uyghurs and other minority ethnic groups in its own country? I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to answer questions, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan, and thanks to all of you for these very interesting and yet alarming interventions. We have a few questions coming in, but I want to start with a more general question for all of you. Several of you mentioned the advantages that AI and automated warfare can avail to governments, especially repressive and autocratic regimes, such as making it easier to control populations, less costly than conventional warfare, even automating or this remote weaponry absolves them from the responsibility to some extent. So in just looking at the larger context, what can be done? Because we all know that repressive and authoritarian regimes are going to do whatever they can to obtain and acquire these technologies and implement them and use them, whether on their domestic populations or transnationally. So what can be done to counter this narrative and even the Israeli PR campaign of trying to export and sell with the technologies and the norms of this surveillance system and automated warfare? We can start maybe with Sophia, and then we'll go around, and I'd like to hear from all of you on this.
That's a great question. I mean, there's a lot that can be done. And I think Amnesty Tech in their report outlines some really important suggestions. I think we have evidence and proof of the effectiveness of exposing both the dehumanizing effects of these technologies, the companies profiting from them, and calling for a ban on the sale and transfer of this technology with the case of the NSO Group, which Amnesty Tech and a consortium of journalists exposed was doing business with many authoritarian regimes, as well as so-called democratic regimes around the world. And their technology was on the phones of thousands of human rights defenders, politicians, lawyers, etc. It was seen as this really scary erosion of privacy, and had this silencing effect on democracy, struggles for human rights worldwide. And the exposure of that one company selling this one very intrusive technology had an enormous effect on the ability of that company to operate. And it also spurred larger campaigns calling for a ban on the sale and transfer of this tech. And I think, joining these movements, calling on a ban of the sale and transfer of AI-powered weaponry writ large is really needed, especially at this moment when the development of this technology is really outpacing regulatory frameworks that we have. And so I think that's one very important thing that can be done. And I'll let some other folks who, are working with organizations with quite actionable requests can take it on from here.
Thank you, Sophia. And I think maybe we can hear from Rasha a little bit more about Amnesty's position on this.
Yeah, sure. And I also just want to start by saying that it's not just so-called authoritarian or repressive regimes that are using this technology. This technology is used in the UK, it's used in the US, it's used across Europe. So I think we also need to counter that narrative. It's being used extensively around the world, which is why we have been calling for a ban on facial recognition technologies for mass surveillance for a while now. And there looks like there might be progress being made on this in the EU with the EU's Artificial Intelligence Act. Although, of course, the devil is in the detail, and we will need to see how this regulation is implemented. But there are also things that people can do on the ground, which is why we structured our campaign very much on a city level. Having collective action on a city level to counter this technology can be really, really powerful. Communities working together to resist municipalities or armies or police forces using this technology can be sometimes much more powerful than trying to get this overarching legislation, whether it be on a national, regional, or international level, which often takes a long time. There are still things that people can do on a city level. There are also really creative campaigns that have been run, wearing clothes that can't detect you on facial recognition cameras, wearing makeup that evades facial recognition technologies. There are all sorts of really interesting ways to resist this kind of technology. But just on a macro level, AI needs to be regulated, and it needs to be regulated with a human rights-based approach. And there needs to be oversight mechanisms over the use of and development of AI tech, and there needs to be accountability for the misuse of this tech. I think that that's really crucial. I think if there's no accountability, then impunity will pervade. And so I think, yeah, with joining these campaigns that Sophia was talking about, but also getting creative in the ways that we resist these technologies and advocating for that larger North Star of regulation is going to be really, really important.
Thank you, Rasha. And on this issue of regulation and accountability, I want to move to Rohan. And what mechanisms can be used to push for such regulations? We know that the UN system is, in a way, bureaucratically and fiscally beholden to the governments that would like to see this AI technology developed and used.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think therein lies the challenge, of course, that states are themselves champing at the bit to get hold of these technologies and to use them domestically. And so their interest in international regulation through the UN or other bodies is minimal. It's really important that this remains on the radar of, for example, UN treaty bodies, of special procedures, and that the modern aspects of Israel's discriminatory control and how these are enabled by technology, and the links between what's happening in Israel and other places are included in submissions and information that is provided to the accountability mechanisms that we know do exist. So there is an angle for this with regards to the International Criminal Court's investigation. This is an element of the persecution of Palestinians. The Commission of Inquiry that has been set up by the UN Human Rights Council, which is looking at the root causes of violence and the situation in the OPT, needs to, of course, consider how technology is facilitating that. But maybe it'd be a bit difficult at the moment to put much hope in those international mechanisms. I want to focus a little bit on the domestic, because I think there are a couple of other things that are important too. Firstly, the literacy of policymakers on this issue is very low. On AI issues generally, and particular on these sorts of issues relating to surveillance, it's very rare to come across, actually, for example, a politician, a policymaker, even if they have supposedly a specialist interest in these issues, that has a really deep understanding of the issues, of the technologies themselves, of their implications. And a lot of the education of policymakers, of course, is done by the companies and not done by human rights organizations or others. And that is a significant challenge. But in order to improve policymaker literacy, we also need to improve public literacy. So I think there's a huge amount that needs to be done in terms of public information on these sorts of issues. But there's one other thing which I think is a bit more complicated, which is, of course, that we need to think of these technologies in their broadest possible implications. And for domestically, in the UK, for example, the interest in live facial recognition surveillance is completely concurrent with policies of successive governments that have been interested in reducing expenditure, state expenditure, in austerity politics. If you have fewer police on the streets, but you still have, the levels of crime that you need to, or you have fewer resources within all sorts of different structures of your state, then it's very attractive to a government like the UK to hear, well, actually, here's a piece of technology that you can have. It's been tested and tried and tested by Israel, and it's going to save you a lot of money, a lot of human resources, and you'll still have the same control that you did before. So austerity economics is a really important part of why these technologies are proliferating. And the self-interest of states in those sense is one of the things that Israel's export industry of these technologies obviously clings on to.
Thank you, Rohan. Muna, if you have any comments on this, but also I want to pose another related question to you as well on the Palestinians. We've been talking about Palestinians as the Palestinian population as a target of this surveillance system, but Palestinians have agency and they've been resisting the occupation, but also the surveillance. How are Palestinians resisting the surveillance systems or infrastructure that Israel is using?
Thank you for all the panelists and for you, Tamara, for starting this. To be honest, since you started speaking about the infrastructure and the extra question, like I didn't mention at the beginning that Palestinians till now, like we are in 2023, they don't control the ICT infrastructure in Palestine, which basically means that we don't have any kind of privacy, neither on the national level, like within our system, with the PA or with our corporates and with our ICT companies, or externally with the Israeli authorities and with others, or even beyond that with the big tech companies when it comes to Palestinians' data and how's that used to like for ads purposes and for other purposes by tech giants, which is basically disaster in such like in this era. That's the first thing that we need to start talking about. And Palestinians were granted the right to take over our ICT infrastructures since our ICT infrastructure since the Oslo Accords, but since then we didn't take over anything, and the Israeli authorities are still controlling that. And even there are some local campaigns demanding the PA to legislate the privacy and data protection law, but we internally know that this is useless, because even if we have such a legislation, we are not using that against the big tech companies or against the Israeli authorities, which means legislations in our context is a bit tricky. And because we have the occupying power, then we are not like able to hold them accountable. That said, I also want to mention that for a very long time, since we are talking about campaigns by different, like that Rasha and Sophia highlighted, we need to remind ourselves all the time that surveillance technologies are used to demobilize people and to discourage them from organizing themselves and mobilizing themselves, which means that whenever people feels that they are watched all the time, they will less likely to think about how they can organize or mobilize themselves. Unfortunately, that's because the fear and because they are threatened of being arrested or interrogated or sometimes sentenced. That said, we need to think about like different levels of how we can resist and confront such kind of technologies. And we're speaking today, like, and I don't know if you are aware, but like the EU Parliament, they have been talking about the AI Act. And they started also discussing that more closely nowadays, which basically means like it sounds really brilliant for the EU residents or citizens. But when it comes to people in the global south, in general, not only in Palestine, this is like we are really far away from having such legislations, and we need to think more on how such kind of legislations in the global north, in the EU, and sometimes in other countries in the global north, like the US and Canada, is or have implications on the global south, because this means that the market is shrinking for them. Tech companies or surveillance companies are now excluding the EU, the US, and Canada, and other global north countries because they have legislations that will hold tech companies accountable and surveillance companies accountable. But they have immunity in the global south countries, and more particularly in the complex situations such as Palestine, as we are living in a very, like, in a messy situation for so long, which means that such kind of situation put us in a way to think how we can join the forces with other global south countries, global south human rights defenders and organizations to confront and resist surveillance technologies from one hand, and from the other hand, we need to think how we can put pressure and the lawmakers and legislators in the global north to force them also take responsibility regarding what's happening in the global south. And I know, like, we're talking about AI, but there are so many other legislations, like the DSA also, and other legislations in the global north. And even whenever we are talking about, for example, the the GDPR that was legislated in Europe, it was a great turning point for people in Europe. But when it comes to the tech companies, we can't forget how tech companies started to cultivate more data from the global South countries, from Far East Asia, and from Africa, to have more testing battlegrounds for their products, and to have more data of users' data, so they can improve, quote unquote, the user experience. And here we know we need to think about the global North responsibilities toward the global South countries, and how we can put more pressure, beside the whole like UN mechanisms that Rohan started and touched base upon. So this is what I wanted to say. And on the other hand, we need also to think on the ground how we can creatively resist that. I believe as Palestinians, we've resisted the social media monitoring and surveillance in a very creative ways, but that also put us in the corner whenever anyone is talking about like content moderation policies, oppression that comes from content moderation policies. People usually say, yeah, but you Palestinians find alternatives on how you can talk about your own issues, or how you can manipulate the algorithms. And here is the problem, like other people around the world normalize this kind of oppression, and they are counting on our creativity to manipulate such kind of technologies and such kind of suppression. But instead of just thinking how we can resist in our own reality after living decades under this military occupation, we're thinking how we can confront big tech companies, social media companies, surveillance companies, and then the Israeli military occupation. And on the top of that, we have our authoritarian government that is also oppressing us and silencing our voices. And this is a bit frustrating, but again, like there's always hope in joining the forces with other people around the world to confront such kind of technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. I would like to give the chance to Sophia to maybe address this last question about how Palestinians are resisting. You've done some interviews, I think, if you have something to add to this.
Yes, thanks for the question. And thanks, Mona, for touching on so much. I think Mona touched on some of the key ways that Palestinians have kind of gotten around dragnet surveillance on digital platforms, be it content moderation that flags any sort of speech that's sharing pictures of protest or decrying another bombardment in Gaza as incendiary and accusing it of inciting violence. And there's specific ways that Palestinians have gotten around that. They've also, I will say that in moments when I've talked to Palestinians who were involved with the May uprising in Jerusalem and going to protests, they talk about all of these different ways that they use social media and location sharing devices to kind of get around police brutality and military violence in those moments. But I don't really want to, I kind of want to flip the question, because Mona gave some really good points. And I do want to say that it's really important both for there to be, if at all possible, to kind of spread awareness among Israelis about the effects of this technology on Palestinians, because there's a complete lack of awareness among many, many people who even spend, 2 to 4 years carrying out some of this work of listening in on phone conversations and building up surveillance technology. There's a complete lack of awareness on its humanitarian impact on the ground and the impact that it has on civilians across the West Bank and Gaza. And so I think that's a really important point. And I think another important point to make is that, within tech conglomerates around the world, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, these big companies that employ thousands and thousands of people, they're also, as Mona was saying, drawn into the work of maintaining Israel's surveillance apparatus and maintaining the really intrusive surveillance of civilians within, democracies, within countries across the global South. And I think that there's all of these ways that the really mundane work of working in the tech sector can actually contribute to the erosion of fundamental human rights and fundamental privacy, both in places like Palestine, but also, in places that many of the listeners might call home. And I think that we need to think really carefully about how any other kind of white-collar technology job is building up runaway developments in artificial intelligence and solidifying government's surveillance of civilians all over the world. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of work that could be done in terms of just resistance at the grassroots level in that sense as well.
Thank you, Sophia. That's a great point. And when I mentioned the campaigning by some of the Google employees against Project Nimbus, and I think that was one of the successful examples. But speaking of the private sector, we have a couple of questions about the BDS campaign, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and what companies in the US or Europe are involved in this technology or this surveillance system. Do they have a role in supporting the Israeli surveillance system? And do you know of any companies that are on the BDS list when it comes to AI and autonomous weapons? Any of you can answer that. Feel free to just jump in.
Maybe I'll start by saying I don't know the answer to that question. But as we showed in our report, there is one Dutch company which is implicated in providing this hardware that is being used for facial recognition in the OPT. But it's a really important question, and others on the panel might know the answer. But I think this is part of the problem, that there is a huge secrecy and lack of transparency around who is providing the technology, and also the fact that I think Muna and Sophia also touched on this. Israel makes much of this technology itself. So from that perspective, it's really difficult to control how the technology is being used if the country that is misusing the tech is also a pioneer in developing and exporting the technology. But there are, other things that I guess that we can use as pressure points in terms of pressuring investors, pressuring other companies to not provide certain parts and components that would support Israel's industry. Before coming into tech, my previous work was on arms control, and similarly with arms production, Israel produces much of its own arms, as well as also, of course, importing lots from the United States. But there were ways back then to try and stop other companies who were providing parts and components which were supporting, for example, Israel's drone industry, and trying to if you can't stop Israel from producing its own, then trying to stop others facilitating Israel's production. But others might have more information than me.
Thank you, Rasha. Anyone else on this point? All right.
I'll just say that there's the database of Israeli military and security exports is a really good resource for folks who are curious about the specific Israeli companies that are exporting abroad. And then there's also, I think, a Stockholm-based database of weapons sales and transfers. I think I'm botching the name. I can put the links in the chat, but these are great databases that other organizations have kind of assembled to track both Israeli arms exports and global trade in weapons and surveillance technology. So I think that's one place to start for those who are interested.
Thank you. And I think part of this is that a lot of different elements go into this surveillance system, from hardware to software and computing and so on. And so there's probably multiple layers involved. We have another question about regulations. I know we talked about this a little bit, but we have a few questions about banning AI altogether versus regulating AI. And I would like to hear your thoughts on this. I know Amnesty wants to ban, or is calling for banning, facial recognition in particular. But if we're talking about AI, and many of you mentioned the EU AI Act, which kind of categorizes AI into several categories: unacceptable risk, high risk, generative AI, and low risk, I think. What are your thoughts on this, and how useful is that categorization, and what are your thoughts on banning AI altogether? Maybe Rohan, we'll start with you.
I mean, I would defer to others on the panel who have a lot more expertise than I do on the specific actions to ban and the EU part of it. But I think my perspective is going to be that banning AI will the cat is out of the bag really when it comes to AI. We're talking about regulation, and perhaps I think it's reasonable. I think former Special Rapporteur David Kay made a call, and I know a number of others have, on prohibiting, or at least a moratorium on the development, the sale and transfer of these technologies until there's better regulation. But I don't think we have to be realistic about what we think is possible, and sadly, I don't think we're going to be seeing a ban on AI generally. And I have to be honest, maybe neither should we want to. There are potential. We're focused very much here on the negative possibilities of AI, but there are potential positive uses if well regulated, if applied within a human rights framework relating to medical advances and learning and scientific advances, which I think are really necessary. So we need to be targeted. We need to be specific and have clear objectives with our advocacy. So I think we will be looking at specific types of technologies and specific types of application.
Thank you, Rohan. Any other thoughts on this idea of categorizing AI or banning AI?
Well, I also think that banning AI is not realistic, and we need to be realistic about our advocacy demands. But also we need to keep in mind how like legislations are lagging behind technology, and even we as human rights advocates, whenever we are trying to influence, that through putting pressure, or through putting pressure on legislators and decision makers. And from my point of view, that's not enough. We also need to engage with engineers and people who design the tech in itself, because they need to be aware about the human rights principles, international human rights law, and the implications, the social and behavioral and long-term implications of their technology on our societies and on our behavior. So they think how they can design their technologies, because for example, the social media companies, they just like produce products that brings more money to them, because they are, at the end of the day, they are corporates that seeks, or they who have like economic interests and sometimes political interests, but they don't think about how's that going to have implications on people, on the users, on their mental health. And that's why we need not only to engage with policies, because we can have like that, like a very nice or a very well-written human rights policy for the tech companies, different tech companies. But then when it comes to the implementation and to the design of the technology itself, it would be different, because the engineers who are designing the technology, who are basically designing the algorithms and using the data to teach the AI machine learning, won't like be aware of those principles. And that's why we need to think how we can go more or beyond only regulating and having like good regulations in this regard. And here we also need to think about how those technologies are also changing our geopolitics. And since then we can think more on how we can design a better like advocacy campaigns, and how we can, where we should put pressure more to influence the decision-making process in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. And I think it's a good point. A lot of us know that most of these companies are for profit. They're profit motivated, and they're working with governments and militaries that have geopolitical agendas. And so I think, as Rohan mentioned, this point that a lot of you have mentioned is important to highlight here, that we need to create literacy around AI in general, but also around the human rights considerations of developing AI and surveillance technologies. We have about a minute left, so I want to give each one of you a chance to give concluding remarks, about 20 seconds. We'll go in the same order that we started. And in case you want to comment on anything else that was mentioned during the discussion, we'll start with Rasha.
I think I would just say that the journey to a ban, to regulation, to human rights compliance, all of this is long-term work. So I think, let's not expect impact in months or even years. It will take us a really long time to get the impact that we want, and we need as many people to join us as possible.
Excellent. Mona, concluding statement.
Maybe I'll give the floor to Sophia because I've spoken in the previous question. So Sophia, go ahead.
Sophia.
Thanks. I guess I'll just say that, the development and implementation of this technology is not inevitable. There are plenty of examples in the past of people, including technology sector workers, rising up and stopping the deployment of repressive technology. And so we should remember that. And I think that for those listening who are based, in the United States or Europe, you should think carefully about how, your universities, your places of work are also involved in the development of these kinds of technologies. There's all sorts of surprising deals between universities and departments of defense worldwide, not just in Israel, where some of the most nefarious experimentations in artificial intelligence and surveillance are taking place. And many of us may be bound up in the development of this technology in ways we're not even aware of. So just look into that carefully as well.
Thank you, Rohan.
I'd like to associate myself with everyone else's remarks. I always like to leave on a point of hope. And one thing I would say here is that the start of this, as Rasha said, this is a marathon, not a sprint. But it starts with information. People simply don't know about this in the levels that are needed, and that education and seminars like this and everything that comes with it is a vital first step. But also there are big opportunities here with a global conversation which is starting to happen, far too late, but starting to happen on the regulation of AI, including, whatever you may think of them, former senior people within big tech companies suddenly coming out and deciding that there are risks here that need to be calculated. Well, the risks are happening right now on the ground for Palestinians. And so that story that's happening globally needs to be connected very much with what's happening very locally.
Thank you, Rohan, and thanks to all of you for this excellent and very enlightening discussion. Thanks for your interventions and remarks and for your time with us today. With that, we have reached the end of the webinar. On behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C., I would like to thank the speakers and the audience and the video of this discussion in case you are interested. The video will be available on our website later today. Thank you again. Please stay in touch and follow us at arabcenterdc.org. Take care, everyone.